Okay, so we are now recording. Let me just give a little bit of background information on the Critical Antiquities Workshop. In the idea of critical antiquity, I and my co-director, who is with me today, Tristan Bradshaw, believe that the contemporary critique of modernity and the capitalist present finds its most powerful impetus in its dialogue with the thought and practice of the ancient world. And we believe that it is not simply that antiquity offers an alternate pole from which to grasp the present in its historical situatedness, but rather we advance a more radical suggestion that our modalities of critique are founded upon and perhaps ought to be refounded upon the expansive dialogues we enter into consciously or unconsciously with the form and content of antiquities performances, literature, and institutional practices. But our turn to antiquity is not a romantic one. In our view, antiquity simultaneously serves as a standpoint and object of critique to enliven us to the possibilities and limitations of contemporary life. Now, this Critical Antiquities project, however, in our view, cannot proceed authentically without properly thinking through the historically contingent and practical nature of that form and content of antiquities, performances, literature, and institutional practices. We need a critical philology in order to foreground and accompany our Critical Antiquities project. It is therefore with great gratitude and excitement that Glenn Most, one of the world's leading classical philologists, can join our final workshop for the year to share his thoughts on this very question of a critical philology. Glenn Most is external scientific member of the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. He's professor on the Committee of Social Thought at the University of Chicago and has recently retired as professor of Greek philology at the Scuola Normale di Pisa. For at least 4 decades, Glenn has contributed books, articles, and edited collections and translations dedicated to the elucidation of classical philology. Currently, his research is pushing at the frontier of new theoretical expressions of the histories and practice of philology, which includes coordinating an international team of specialists, compiling a groundbreaking and extraordinarily exciting looking lexicon of global philological practice, as well as publishing essays in which the fundamentals of philology are questioned and reframed. So in a fortuitous conjuncture, Glenn's current work, through a redefinition of philology and its global comparative histories, seems to open up for us in the Critical Antiquities Network a way of conceiving what that critical philology might entail. So it is my pleasure to welcome you here to our final workshop, Glenn.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thank you for that introduction, which I cannot possibly hope to live up to, but I will do my best to show people in the discussion how somebody like you could possibly have had those wonderful ideas about my work. Thank you.
My pleasure. Well, look, so the format of our discussion will take the form of an interview, and I will pose some questions and we'll see where it takes us for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then for about 25 to 30 minutes or thereabouts, I'll open up the floor for select questions. Now we have a procedure for asking questions, which will be to write the question in the chat box or to type the letter Q, and then I will manage the questions that are posed to our distinguished guest. But I thought, okay, let's start. Your recent projects, Glenn, seek to establish a new comparative and global ground for philology, which is nevertheless, though, an old and well-worn term. What do you think we should understand by philology in the 21st century today?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ben, for this whole discussion and for this first and very fundamental question. Um, what philology means is up for grabs, and I don't think that there is any one definition that is the only correct one. In the United States, most people think in the term philology, of a tradition that goes back to 19th century German historical linguistics. So that philology is the study of languages and their historical development, and comparative philology is the study of the relations between languages and their historical development. I don't think that that's wrong. That's the way linguistics defines it. But it seems to me that there's another older sense of philology, which can usefully serve to understand what scholars who are not linguists in this narrow sense do and have done in history and throughout the world. Philology is, of course, a Greek term, and it is used in a variety of ways in ancient Greece to refer to relations of fondness or care that people have for logoi, for discourse, for words, for language. And if it's taken in that very broad sense, it can usefully be used to describe the way that scholars have worked on texts, both oral texts and written texts throughout the world. When I say scholars, I have something particular in mind. It's not enough for me to be a philologist to simply like texts, to be fond of them or to spend one's time reading them. Philology picks out a profession of people who are engaged in the caring for texts in a professionalized and institutional manner. Professionalized means that they have been trained within institutions, and institutions like schools, universities, libraries, archives, examination systems, and so forth, give the framework within which society gives these people the resources that they need in order to care for the texts that the society needs. This is a broader definition, but I hope it's not too broad, and that I hope also that it can help to pick out an activity or a group of activities which have been performed and are continuing to be performed today throughout the world and throughout history. So I would say in a word, philology for me is the professionalized and institutionalized study of and care for authoritative texts.
We chatted earlier in the week about the strangeness of the etymology of the word philology. The fact that at first glance, one might expect it to mean the study of friendship, perhaps, or something like that, right? Whereas the more correct, perhaps, description of what we do is logophilia or something like that. So it is a strange word, and it's a strange species of ology in that sense. You've suggested that a kind of a defining moment in the meaning of the word is Eratosthenes' appropriation of the term for himself in the 3rd century BC. And you suggested that it was to differentiate himself from the philosophos in some way. Is that something that you can expand upon a little bit?
Yes, there are ancient reports that Eratosthenes was the first to call himself a philologos. And as you pointed out, it's a strange term. In a certain sense, we should be logologists because we do a study of logoi. But you can see why the Greeks didn't go down that road. The same strangeness of philologia is also found in philosophia. Philosophia is not wisdom about friendship. It's a fondness for wisdom. And while there is no certainty about when people in ancient Greece started calling themselves philosophers, it is probably, I think, a invention of Plato and the Academy, and was retrojected backward onto people like Pythagoras. this is a view that has been disputed, and there's an interesting, very interesting new book by Christopher Moore on the origins and early meaning of the term philosopher. Nonetheless, by the time that Eratosthenes was writing, philosophos was a perfectly normal word, and it defined people who engaged in thinking and in criticizing thinking. Eratosthenes, who was a great scholar and also poet and head of the library in Alexandria, I think intended to, by calling himself philologos, to distinguish himself from the philosophers and to say, well, you know, they are doing their cloudy conceptual abstractions. I'm working with real words and concrete materials. He was a geographer, mathematician. He was a man of science. Whether the term for him was intended also to cover the fact that he worked in very different fields, and to suggest that there was a unity to these fields, I don't know. But there does seem to be fairly good reason to associate the term with him, and thereby to associate the term with the museum and library in Alexandria, and with the institutions in which the philologists that we study most, like Aristarchus and Apollonia and Aristophanes of Byzantium and Zenodidus, worked.
So just as a side note to that, then philology really sort of has its origins in a sort of textual environment, which presupposes writing and familiarity with textual practice.
Yes, absolutely. Although it's not completely certain that this was Eratosthenes' invention, but I think that there's good reason to think it. But let me add one little parenthetical remark to what you just said. There's a tendency, which I think is regrettable, to limit the notion of texts to written artifacts. Their oral texts are texts too. And even if a philology is directed professionally in the first instance to written texts, there is always an oral tradition in the text that it's studying. And above all, there's an oral aspect to the philological practices that are being engaged. We right now are doing oral philology. And even though we also publish and write, a lot of what we do, not only in teaching, but also in our research, consists in discussions that we have. Throughout the world, there are different forms of oral poetry, oral literature, and oral practices of philology, as well as written ones.
Well, I guess that allows us to kind of segue a little bit into the next question, which is that your work is really focused much more on the practices of philology rather than the biographies of philologists, so to speak. And so perhaps it was a bit unfair of me to kind of mention Eratosthenes, but perhaps we should be talking more about the practices of Alexandria, etc. So my question then would be, why do you argue for a shift in focus from that sort of heroic biographical tradition of the history of philology more towards the histories of philological practice and institutions?
I'm not the only person to do so. When I was studying back in the 20th century, not the 19th century, histories of scholarship were essentially biographies of famous scholars. They often spent a lot of time talking about the lives and gave some scurrilous anecdotes, and Sands gave illustrations of what they looked like. And then there would be a list of their great accomplishments and especially their great publications. And reading one of these, this is true of Sands, it's true of Wilamowitz, it's true of Pfeiffer to a certain extent. Reading one of these was like being taken through a gallery of portraits of the ancestors, each one with his books and his accomplishments, and the guide would stop in front of each one and say what kind of person he was. Or, of course, he did drink too much, or he did have problems with his wife, but basically that was the level of discussion. That was not only the way that histories of classical scholarship were done back then, but it was the way that histories of other fields were done as well. Histories of physics, histories of mathematics, histories of chemistry were also done the same way. And what happened in the middle of in the second half of the 20th century was that in a number of fields, and in particular in the history of science, there came to be a recognition that this was not the only way to do the history of science, that doing it in this way focused too much upon biographies and individuals. It ended up being teleological. It gave a Whig history in which the whole history was designed to culminate in a certain person, namely the author of that history. And it made it very, very difficult to compare the history of science or any particular science from one country to another, because it was simply a history of individuals. What history of science suggested that we could do instead was to focus not so much upon the great men, they were almost always men, but upon the teams of people who were working together, and not upon their great discoveries, but upon the practices that they engaged in order to make those discoveries. So there's a shift in the history of science to studying the laboratory and studying practices, as well as other things like epistemological emotions, for example. It seemed to me when I discovered this that this was exactly what we needed in the history of scholarship, in the history of classical scholarship as well, that I was lucky enough to have lived in a time in which, for the first time, people really got an understanding of the classical tradition in the West and of the history of classical scholarship in the West. Beyond the anecdotal, they started to understand the structures of the Greco-Roman classical tradition and classical scholarship. What that meant, though, was that we had started to understand one tradition. But you can't understand one tradition unless you see how it is like, unlike other traditions. So I have been trying for years to push for a comparative philology, not in the sense of 19th century linguistics, but in the sense of comparing the practices that have engaged the attention of Western scholars and institutions with the practices that have engaged the attention of classical traditions throughout the world. It's only on the level of practices that you can compare things. If you try to compare one person with another, as Aristotle said, there is no episteme of the individual because the individual is unique. What there is an episteme of is what an individual does to solve problems. Because, and then I'll try to wrap up this too long answer to your wonderful question, because the problems that philologists deal with are very similar throughout the world. All cultural traditions depend upon a small number of texts, which, if they're written texts, have to be copied. And until the 19th century, it was impossible to copy them except by hand. And even with printing, there was the person who set the print in China in the 9th century or in Italy in the 15th century. Wherever people copied by hand, they made mistakes. Wherever texts were written on perishable materials, those materials perished. So there had to be a constant regeneration of texts that were necessary for cultural traditions. The more important the text was, the more often it was copied, and the more likely it was for there to be divergences among these copies. Well, this is a problem that all philologists in all cultural traditions have faced, but the ways that they have, the ways that these problems were posed to them depended upon the notion of what the authoritative texts were, what kind of materials they were written on, what kind of texts they were, what the institutions were, how the language worked, and so forth. And the solutions that they came up with differ from culture to culture. It's only if we can look at the level of practices that we can understand that our own practices are not inevitable or self-evident or natural. They're simply the way our particular configuration of factors led these people in these institutions to work. I can give you an example if you want, or
Please.
Okay, just one example. It's one of our fundamental notions that the point of textual criticism is to get to the original correct version of a text and to strip away from it all of the mistaken variants that have grown around this text over the course of its transmission. That is a peculiarity of the Greco-Roman tradition, that it looks at variants as being a terrible problem and tries to get back to the origin which these variants are disfiguring. Even within the Western tradition, this is not the only way that things can be looked at. If Maz thought that the point of Lachmanian textual criticism was to get rid of all the variants and look and discard them as corruptions so you could get back to the original text, Pasquale thought that the variants were innovations and were important testimony to the way a text was regarded in later periods. And in fact, in the Western tradition, in medieval studies, the whole Lachmanian notion that you could get to the origin of the Nibelungenlied or of the Minnesangsfrühling has been replaced by a notion of mouvance, of creative development over time, which is more Pasqualian. But that's within the Greco-Roman tradition. And within the Greco-Roman tradition, a fundamental role has been played by Judaism and Christianity, which have sacred texts, which were given by God. And the sacred text, you had to get it exactly right. And every comma in it was divinely sanctioned. And if you tried to fiddle with the text, you could be burned at the stake. And this is what happened in the West. But that's the West. In other cultural traditions, this same variance of the text can be seen and either simply accepted. In China, people know that the texts are different from one another, and they regard this as an interesting fact, and they discuss which ones are more to be taken seriously, but it's not a problem that they lie awake at night thinking about. In other traditions, for example, in Buddhism, the variation among the texts is considered to be a sign of the power of the message of Buddha, which is able to traverse all cultures and all languages. There is no original language of the Buddhist texts. It is present in all of its forms with all of its variations, and that proliferation is regarded as a good thing. Now, I'm not saying that we have to apply these ideas to our own classical texts, but I am saying that if we look at our own procedures and classical texts and practices in the light of such comparisons, it'll make it easier for us to understand where our texts are coming from, where we're coming from, and what are the multiple possibilities that we have open to us.
It sounds too like you're also suggesting a way of reframing the relationship between the text critic, the text curator, and the text. Is that right?
Yes. Let me give you an example. One of the fundamental imperatives in textual criticism in the West has been the necessity of choice. You have variants, and you have to choose which is the right one, and the other ones you can discard, or you can put in the bottom of the page in an apparatus criticus. In any case, the activity of choice and the necessity of choice is the fundamental movement of the Western textual criticism. Well, I don't think people have thought enough about the fact that the main reason for this necessity of choice has been that on traditional bearers of texts, like stones or papyri or pot shards or paper, you can't put two words in the same place. And you can only put one word in one place. And if you have a sentence, then in that place of one word, there's only one word you can put. Because of that, you have to choose which word to put there. Well, what about electronic media? With an electronic medium, you can click on a word and you can immediately see all the other words that are there, and you don't have to necessarily privilege any one word. You can have a drop down, you can show in all kinds of ways the whole range of choices that are available to you, and you don't have to choose which one. That is to say, the whole ethos of choice was dependent upon the peculiarities of the materiality of the bearer of the text. Now, I happen to think that even in an electronic medium, it is the obligation and the responsibility of an editor still to indicate which he thinks are the more interesting or the more likely variants and which ones are likely to be erroneous. After all, the editor is somebody who has been spending years and years paid by society's money to work on this text, so he has a certain obligation to the people who just come in to the internet from outside and who don't know as much. But even so, I don't think the editor has an obligation in such a medium to decide only this can be the right reading and all the others must be mistaken. So I think that this is an example for how the material conditions in which we work, as I say, the materials upon which we work, lead to certain practices which can be thought of as being self-evident, but which aren't.
So that then leads me to think about processes like authorization, the formation of canons. If you're redefining or you're suggesting a definition of philology as the curation of authoritative texts, that would then, I suppose, require us to look quite closely at what authority is and how it's mandated, how it's kind of developed, what sort of institutions and professions curate authority as well as the texts, I suppose.
Absolutely. I'm glad that you picked up on my use of the word authoritative in the definition that I gave of philology, because it does seem to me that that philologists tend not to work professionally on all texts, but on a very small subset of texts. After all, you and I and everybody else are constantly producing texts all the time, shopping lists, letters, notes to ourselves, and we don't curate those as philologists, and I hope that nobody will ever curate mine as a philologist. There's a famous case in which one of the notes in one of Nietzsche's notebooks is, I lost my umbrella. And there's a long essay, I can't remember whether it's by Foucault or by Derrida, on this note and what that means. So be careful about what you put into writing. What philologists tend to work on are a tiny subset of texts, and given that they are given resources by the state, by their states, and work within institutions, these texts that they work on tend to be a subset of texts that is of particular interest to their countries and institutions. Now, often these texts are called canonical. And I'm a little bit, I prefer not to use the term canonical, although it's useful in certain cases, because it raises the wrong kinds of associations in my mind. Canonical is ultimately a theological concept in the West. Is connected to the question of which books of the Old Testament and of the New Testament are considered to be acceptable. It's connected to questions of heresy, of heterodoxy. People have been killed because they worked with non-canonical texts. It also suggests that there is a real difference between an inside and an outside. There's a canonical and there's a non-canonical. So I prefer to talk in terms of authoritative because it's a looser concept. It's not as inside or outside. It's not theological. It suggests instead, as you pointed out, structures of authority that a society has an interest in perpetuating or in putting into question. Such authoritative texts are, in general, what I think philologists work on. One more thing, if I may say about that. Philologists sometimes say, first comes the authoritative text, and then comes the philologist who is simply there to serve it and to explain it. But in fact, what makes the text authoritative is usually the work of the philologist in the first place. So I think that canonization is not something that precedes philology, nor authorization, but that it is one of the effects of philology.
Forgive me. You could even imagine that a text becomes authoritative because a philologist has produced a critical edition of it, right?
Mm-hmm. Indeed. And it happens very often that people nowadays also create texts in order to achieve social ends. And for example, I was having a discussion last Friday with a group of people in Berlin. There's there's a Jewish Enlightenment writer named Leon, who has hardly been studied, even though he was an important figure in the provincial Jewish Enlightenment in the late 18th century. And now there is a movement to make him important as a way of understanding better the culture of Prussian Judaism at the end of the 18th century. And how are they going to do it? They're going to make a critical edition of his writings, because until now there wasn't one. It's an interesting problem how you make such an edition. That's what we were talking about. But the notion is, if there is an edition, then there will be a field of study. And a lot of the work with women writers, with Black writers, with other minority writers in the United States in the past decades, as these groups have found their voice, has been connected with creating editions of their works.
Yes, I mean, I was just reminded of a conversation I had earlier with Tristan. There is about to be published soon a new critical edition of Capital Volume 1 of Marx. And it strikes me that there's always the question in the background of why do we need a new critical edition of something if there's a serviceable critical edition already? And has that got to do with a range of social, cultural, and political pressures that sponsor this kind of change, right? So that would then point to another aspect of your project, which is the historicizing of philological activity.
It is indeed interesting that there is a sense now that if the last critical edition was done 50 years ago or 100 years ago, then per se we need a new one. And one reason for this is simply that scholars have to eat, and they have families to feed. And if all of the critical editions have been done and one doesn't have to do another one, then scholars are in trouble in some sense. So there's a certain self-perpetuating aspect to the business of scholarship, which is perfectly understandable. But besides that, a text that receives a critical edition tends to do so because it is connected with some set of institutions. And over time, those institutions change. And if the text is valuable, then it will exceed those institutions. Taking the example of Marx, Marx's writings in the 19th century became the object of very severe critical editions organized in Russia and in East Germany in the 20th century, because they were very closely associated with important state institutions in the communist world. But those, the Mega, for example, the Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe, made all kinds of choices in order to give it a kind of sanitized text, in order to smooth off the edges, in order to suppress various aspects of Marx's thought, which were uncomfortable for those communist institutions. And in the meantime, while that edition was brought to an end, Marx's writings started to have enormous impact outside of the communist countries, because they're very interesting philosophically, and they raised all kinds of issues, especially the economic and philosophical manuscripts of the 1840s, manuscripts of Capital, which didn't get adequate reflection in the Mega edition. So the Western countries wanted their own Marx, who would be not the communist Marx, but a humanist Marx, let's say. And then they started to work on their own editions. That is one example, but I can give you an example from literature also. It happens very often that an author's works are published in an edition with or without his complete approval in a rather imperfect way, let's say. Take Kafka. When Kafka died, he asked Max Brod to burn everything, and Brod refused to and made an edition. And the edition he made of Kafka's posthumous works was okay. It was good enough, and Kafka is such a genius that Kafka immediately became recognized as one of the world's greatest writers, which he was. But the more he became recognized as one of the world's greatest writers, the more Brod's edition came into discredit, because he didn't do justice to the complexities, he made connections that weren't made, he made misreadings of all sorts. So now everybody looks down on Brod's original edition And there have been a series of new, ever more precise, ever more detailed, ever more omnicomprehensive editions of Kafka's manuscripts and his other works. The point is, however, that if Broad had published Kafka's works in that modern form, nobody would have read them. Nobody would have it's only because Broad published a kind of fast edition of Kafka. It's a good edition, that then Kafka could become recognized as a genius, and that then people could go to the trouble of wanting to read all of his manuscripts and other things. It's exactly the same thing with Nietzsche. It's exactly the same thing with Hölderlin. It's the same thing with Wittgenstein. It's the same thing with Proust. There are all of these authors for whom there are multiple editions because they began as a non-authoritative text, and then they became an authoritative one. And once they became authoritative, then more people wanted to work on them. Forgive me, but you asked about something I'm interested in.
No. It's wonderful to hear you talk about that. It sort of makes me think too, when you're talking about somebody who is curating a corpus of works of somebody, for instance, who's deceased, but who is considered to be important enough whose work needs to be re-edited or edited and produced. It reminds me then that being a philologist is also a hermeneutic activity, and that, but that modern philology, and by modern philology I mean, since Woolf, for instance, has had an uneasy relationship with hermeneutics. In that there's this kind of romantic idea which you drew attention to before, that our job is to kind of get at the original form and to kind of sweep away the detritus that has kind of accumulated in order to get at the kind of ipsissima verba of the author or whatever. But that is really a hermeneutic activity, right? And your comparison with Marx, a humanist Marx versus a Soviet Marx, is a really interesting one too, because to re-edit Marx then is to reinterpret him.
Absolutely, right? Absolutely. Well, I do think that the tension that you pointed to between hermeneutics and philology in the West is there now, but it wasn't there always. Friedrich Ost, who was a younger contemporary of Wolff's, wrote a hermeneutics. Schleiermacher did a hermeneutics. August Burke did a famous hermeneutics. And Dilthey, who wasn't really a philologist, but a philosopher, was the one who elevated hermeneutics into a philosophical category of thought. So I do think that in the first half of the 19th century, philology and hermeneutics were closer together. But you're absolutely right that they started to diverge at a certain point. And I think that the reason that they diverged is that people recognized that hermeneutics is not an exact science, that it can establish rules for proceeding in trying to understand a text, but it can't tell you when to apply which rule. That for that, you need to have judgment, you need to have experience, you need to have taste and things like that. And that meant that hermeneutics became, I don't want to say the bull in the china shop, but it became a sign for the impossibility of completely scientificizing philology. And in the middle of the 19th century, philology had to start competing with the natural sciences for being a model of scientificity and for getting money from the state. Until the second half of the 19th century, the money that the Prussian government gave to philologists was far more than what they gave toward chemistry, physics, and other natural science fields. And the natural sciences were always complaining about that. It was only towards the end of the 19th century that that turned around. If you think of the corpus of Latin inscriptions or the corpus of Greek inscriptions, those are things that could not possibly have been done without massive funding, both for the publication, but especially for paying the people to do it. So I think that in the second half of the 19th century, classics philology found itself wanting to say, well, yes, I suppose there is some hermeneutics involved, but that's not really what we're doing. We're gathering data, we're making collections, we're doing critical editions, we're doing collections of inscriptions and so forth. That's what you should be paying us for. And I think it is from there that the tension between philology and hermeneutics in the West arose.
So does that mean though then that philologists, it's almost as though they're curating culture as well, right?
I don't want to say what is culture beside a collection of texts, but I do want to say that it's hard for me to conceive of a culture independently of a collection of texts which are being curated by professionals within the culture's institutions. Certainly, people are constantly doing things that are not directly connected with those texts. But if you get those people together and ask them what makes them belong to the same society, then that is going to come down to language and norms and modes of behavior, which in some ways are always connected with texts. To give just one tiny example, in the 19th century, when philology became romanticized and nationalized, it was used in order to create a corpus of texts in the national literature, which could be used in schools in order to teach the language and the history and the values to the school children, so they would grow up to be good citizens within that country. And there'd be French philology versus German philology versus Italian philology versus British philology. And each one would be curating its own texts, Shakespeare, Goethe, Racine, or the song of medieval literature, Dante, Manzoni, for the purposes of national education. So I wouldn't reduce a culture to texts, but I do think that texts are a focal point with which members of a culture identify themselves.
And so that would then draw a lot of scholars' attention to the fault lines or the fracture points within the history of philology at the level of practice. It would sort of interest us to kind of focus on the practical context rather than the sort of rather than the biographical context. So I'm thinking, for instance, of across the course of the 5th century BC in the Greek world, the kind of challenges that were laid down to oral performative poetry, to Homer and so on, and that's almost a kind of a philological dispute as much as a kind of cultural dispute, right?
Yeah, and the 5th and then 4th centuries are crucial for identifying Homer and then the 3 tragedians and the 3 comedians as canonical. And that's connected with government-funded public performances of these authors in state ceremonies and in the schools. And there is exactly what the mechanism is, but it is unclear, but there is a continuity of some sort between this Athenian vision of the classical texts and the work of the philologists in Alexandria in the generations after that. Let me give you another example from another period of change in philological procedures, Lachmann's method, the method for establishing a stemma and for determining which manuscripts are copies of others and for discarding those that are copies of others for the sake of getting back to the archetype. One can follow very clearly in the course of the development of Lachmann's work how he came up with this theory, and it's clear that he didn't do it on his own, but that other people preceded him very helpfully. But what's interesting for me is not the person of Lachmann, but how Lachmann's method responded to exigencies of his period and did so successfully that his method became the method. The exigencies had to do with the fact that there were an enormous number of manuscripts that had been found, that travel and communications meant that one could not only collate the manuscript in the library in one's own town, but could potentially have to collate all of them. So there's an explosion in the number of possible manuscript sources that one had to look at, and that the base of philologists that was being trained in the schools and universities in Germany was getting larger and larger. So you had not only a small number of philologists with exquisite taste who knew what the difference was between an Ovidian Latinism and a Virgilian Latinism, you also had lots of pretty good philologists who didn't have taste, but who wanted to do additions. What Lachmann's method did, it gave the person who didn't have necessarily much judgment a mechanism for selecting which manuscripts to look at and throwing out all the others, and then applying mechanical procedures in order to come up with an edition. And thereby it made it possible to make more editions by more philologists on the basis of fewer manuscripts. And that was something which mechanized the procedure of philology in ways comparable with other sciences in the middle of the 19th century.
Right, and by use of the kind of the analogy of mechanization, Lachmann is contemporary of the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution.
Exactly.
And so there's every reason to suspect that the same kind of animating logics of efficiency and organization that are animating the Industrial Revolution and other comparable sciences like astronomy, mathematics, and so on at the time are sort of feeding into philology at that point. So Lachmann's not an island. He's in a kind of a universe of practices which are not just philological practices.
Exactly. And I don't in the least want to say that Lachmann's was not a genius. He was. And Lachmann's method, whatever people can say against it, was a very, very shrewd way of dealing with certain kinds of problems of transmission in a rational way. It doesn't work for many texts, but the text that it does work for, if you don't apply it, you're not being rational. What I wanted to suggest instead is exactly what you were saying, namely that you understand Lachmann and his method and its success much better when you put him back into the context of European industrialization in the 19th century, out of which he came, into which he belongs. And if you do that, then the history of philology is no longer just a history of great men, it's a history of practices and contexts.
So I noticed, and this will be my last question before I kind of throw open to questions from the floor. But and it's perhaps a kind of tricky one, so I hope I'm not putting you on the spot. But I noted in sort of looking at the sort of the format of your historical lexicon, which looks like an amazing comparative work that looks at all of these different text cultures and their philological practice, that you have a concluding chapter that you're proposing on digital philology, which no doubt will tackle the kind of the internet, and the internet becomes this kind of final text cultural space. And yet, in many ways, the internet seems to promise a kind of a holy grail for philology, doesn't it? Because all of the things which philologists have been complaining about for the last 3 centuries, which is poor transmission, insecure data storage, communication of ideas and so forth. These seem to be, there seems to be a promise that will all be done away with, where we'll be able to, as you said before, with the click of a mouse, we'll be able to kind of look at every manuscript, every variant, and kind of have this instantaneity of access. What do you think, like, are the challenges, not just the benefits, but also the challenges for using the internet and digital philology kind of going forward?
I wish I knew. We're standing at the beginning of a transformation, which I have no reason to think will be the last one. I don't think that the internet is the end of the story. It's simply the most recent development. And it's the last one that I will experience, I suppose. It certainly solves some problems that we have had. For example, the one I mentioned about not being able to put 2 words in the same place. But it raises other problems. One is that it makes immediately accessible to anybody a massive information for which most people don't have the resources and the training to really deal with. One thing that means is that there is even more of a place for experts and for professionals to help people with this massive information than there was before. One thing which I am a strong believer in, I like books. I also like being in rooms together with people. I'm old-fashioned in that way. And I don't think that the internet is going to destroy books, but I think that the existence of the internet makes it possible to conceive of ways in which the book can function differently from in the past. For example, it used to be the case that if you wanted to make all of the variants and all of the manuscripts available, the only way to do that was in a book. And so you have these enormous editions of Nietzsche, for example, or Hölderlin, where every variant and every manuscript is noted as exactly as possible. Well, that works for Nietzsche pretty well, and for Hölderlin better, because there aren't that many manuscripts. But what do you do with somebody like Wittgenstein, for which there are thousands and hundreds of thousands of manuscripts in Norway, I think it is, and nobody really knows what to do with them all. What you, I think, can do is have online a editio maior, or a repertorium for all of the manuscripts and variants, and you make, as a book, a Volksausgabe, an editio minor, which people can carry with them and read in bed and take to the pub and so forth. And that makes the book, it takes a weight off of the shoulders of the book. It makes it easier for the book to be done, and it creates a situation in which people who have some interest in an author, but don't want to dedicate the rest of their lives to him, can buy the cheaper edition as a book, whereas people who really are interested in the author can go online and can find out everything they want to know. So I think that there are possibilities that the internet and digital editions in general offers, with its own problems, and with its own dangers, which we are only now starting to understand. In the same way as at the beginning in the 15th century, when books started being printed, they were printed to look exactly like manuscripts. And manuscripts continued to be written by hand for decades after the introduction of printing. So too, the internet didn't change everything all at once, and we continue to do the things that we have been habituated to do. It'll be the young people who didn't grow up without the internet or without portable telephones, but for whom that is all there has ever been. It'll be those who will conceive of new ways of doing things that people like me can't even imagine.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering too that the internet doesn't solve, or perhaps even creates problems for the question of authority as well, because the internet, I think I made the analogy when we were talking earlier in the week, between the internet and late antique Alexandria, where, you know, on the one hand, the internet has these places where people like us are kind of having authoritative conversation about what philology is, but somewhere in a dark alley, somewhere in the internet, there's a subversive, deviant, Foucauldian sense, presence, where they're saying, well, what gives them the right to say that these texts are authoritative? We're going to have a little space here where we're going to have websites where we've got this counter canon, if you like, right, where we're going to sort of focus on this stuff. And I guess that, I suppose that's a good thing.
Yeah. There are lots of things that happen in the dark web, I'm told, that are not a good thing. But if the dark web also creates the possibility for counter editions, and for other uses of authoritative texts, that's fine too. I'm, in that regard, like Mao, I think that that 1,000 flowers bloom.
Yeah, that's right. Well, look, I'm going to stop hogging you now. And if you've got time for about 15 to 20 minutes or so to take questions from participants and guests here. So just to repeat, if you'd like to ask a question, please type a Q in the chat, or if you prefer not to ask a question, but just simply type your question, I can read it out for you and put that question to Glenn. So does anybody have any questions that they'd like to put to Glenn on some of the very interesting work that he's doing? I think you've wowed everybody into, you've stunned them into silence, Glenn.
I think everybody is really wanting to go to the pub.
Well, I mean, yeah, in Australia, I think it's sort of 7 o'clock in the evening, and And then in Europe, I think you're all gasping for a coffee probably in the morning. Well, look, it is right on the hour. Oh, we have. Thank you, Peter. Uh, uh, would you like to put your question?
Yeah, look, thank you so much, Glenn and Ben. That was just incredibly interesting and wonderful. I just wanted to ask if this vision of a comparative philology can incorporate purely oral culture. I mean, cultures that don't have any sort of professionalization of curation of texts. Sorry, I'm not sure if I'm getting through or not, because my internet connection at home is not so great, but I'll...
No, we can hear you fine.
Did that get through as a question?
Yes, it certainly did.
That's a wonderful question, and it's one which we are discussing in the context of this lexicon of philological terminologies that Ben was so kind to refer to. I firmly believe that it is a mistake to limit philology to practices with written texts, and that in many societies, oral texts are extremely important. And around the bright light of the written text, there is a penumbra and a shadow of partly oral and fully oral texts, which make the written texts vital and allow them to have their role in society. I also think that even in societies in which there isn't a written philological tradition, there is an oral philological tradition curating oral texts. This was the case in the Middle Ages. This is the case in many parts of the world now. The Aborigines in Australia have their oral texts, and for millennia, they've had their oral philology to deal with it. The problem is getting the evidence to talk about it. What is purely oral is in danger of vanishing in a way that what is written often doesn't. So what can you do? You can find the traces of what had been oral in written artifacts or in images. You can find the effects of oral philology. You can find references, stories, and so forth. It's a very, very difficult process, but it seems to me to be one of the most exciting and interesting ones that one can work on. In that lexicon that I referred to, we divide the chapters into about 25 classical traditions, going Japan, Korea, China, Vietnam, Tibet, India, Persia, Mesopotamia, Turkic, Hebrew, Arabic, going west to Greeks and Romans, Egyptian, Coptic, Slavonic, et cetera, et cetera. And it includes also the Mayan classical tradition, because with the Mayan tradition, there are written documents, there are the inscriptions and some later manuscripts. But we don't have a chapter on, for example, African philology south of the Sahara. We are sure that there is, but we don't have the means or the experts or the testimony that we need in order to do it. So all that we can do is talk about this lack in the introduction, say that this seems to us to be one of the most important frontiers for philological research for the future, and hope that there will be a second edition in which we can include it, or that other people will come and be inspired to do it. So this is something that we feel is a tremendous lack, but it's not going to hold us back from doing what we can do with the evidence that we have. Does that answer your question, Peter?
Oh, wonderful, yeah, incredibly stimulating prospect.
I'll just add as an addendum, if I may, that Glenn, you've also spoken about that we should differentiate between canonical texts and perhaps genre canons, so that we can talk about the text curation of authoritative genres like epic poetry, within which, though, there is variable content and a lack of fixity. So that's...
Yeah, it was a conversation that Ben and I had a couple of days ago, in which I was pointing out that our notion that a canonical text was one in which the words are not allowed to be changed, doesn't take account of other societies in which the genre is canonical, but different texts can play the role of being the text within that genre that is referred to. And those can vary without any problem. So, again, one has to be very careful in thinking about what exactly the philologist is doing.
Paul Roach, you have a question.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Glenn. I'm hoping this answer doesn't have an utterly obvious, this question doesn't have an utterly obvious answer, but I mean, in your discussion, you've talked about a couple of moments in antiquity where a sort of strongly empiricist drive takes over the curation of texts, so Alexandria and the advent of Christianity. And I was wondering if, I can't quite put my, this is why I'm worried there's an obvious answer, I can't quite think of an example of a cultural moment in antiquity. Or I guess the question's best asked straight. Do you know of a moment in antiquity where there is a more creative, less empiricist sort of reception of textual variants that is put on display by either philologists or philologically inclined poets? I can think of controversies that are dealt with in particular ways by Alexandrian poets. I can't quite put my finger on textual variants sort of coming into play in the same way as though to say my version of X has X reading, and or is there a phenomenon like that, or in a late antique treatment of pagan texts? I'm not quite sure.
That's a wonderful question. What I can point to is the practice of certain Alexandrian poets, especially Apollonius Rhodius, and to a certain extent Callimachus, who show in their poetry their awareness of scholarly controversies about the understanding of Homer. So that Apollonius will use a word that is discussed controversially in the scholarship on Homer in such a way that he shows that he knows both sides of the issue, but prefers the one to the other. This has been discussed it was already discussed in the ancient commentaries on Apollonius, and it's been discussed in modern work on him as well. There's a very good book on this by the professor of Greek in Saloniki, Rengakos, and there's an article by Rudolf Kassel, and it's a field of interpretation all its own. Then out of that genre of scholarly poets or scholar poets in Alexandria, you get then in later Greek epic poetry, occasional passages of the same sort. I'm thinking, for example, of Appian, I'm thinking of Coluthus, I'm thinking of Nonnus. These are people who read Homer with commentaries, and wrote poetry showing that they knew the commentaries, and often liked to do the same kind of games that Apollonius and other Hellenistic poets had done. I will add parenthetically that you can see that Virgil read Homer with the Scholia, and that there are passages in the Aeneid which are quite obviously his response to the Scholia to Homer. And one of the differences between Catullus and Horace is that Catullus reads Sappho. He just reads the poems. He doesn't care about the commentaries, whereas Horace reads Sappho with the commentaries and therefore has a different Sappho in mind. In the later Alexandrian period that you're talking about, outside of poetry, I think that happens less, and that's because with Christianity, there's more of the focus upon, not playing with different variants, but finding out what is the truth, what is the right one. Mm-hmm. Does that answer your question?
It does, yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have a question from a student at the University of Sydney, from Aryan Mohseni. He asks, what was the state of philology in America in the early 19th century? In particular, was it at all influenced by the contemporary developments in the field in the German tradition at the time?
That's a wonderful question, Aryan. And I can tell you that philology in America was brought over from an English model but in a period in which in Oxford and Cambridge, i.e. the 18th century, not much was happening. It was only in the 1830s or so, 1820s and 30s, that America started to develop a philological tradition, but not so much with the English model, but with the German model. And there were lots of Americans who went to Germany and studied theology or classics, and then came back to America and taught it there. It was then Johns Hopkins University, which at the second half of the 19th century created a doctoral school based upon the German doctoral schools. So I think that Emerson and Thoreau were certainly influenced by German thinkers. There's no doubt that Emerson was, and the other transcendentalists were, but I think they were influenced less by nitty-gritty German philologists than they were by German philosophers. So people like Schelling, Kreutzer, Goethe, more than people like Wolff and Burke. Let me know if that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Yes, thanks very much.
Thank you for your question.
We have another question from Melina, a very interesting question. She would like to ask whether you think, Glenn, that the project of global philological practice could eventually lead to a kind of unified methodology of doing philology, or will it rather underline the limits of such an attempt?
That's a wonderful question, which hadn't occurred to me. I can tell you that my own personal suspicion is that there will never be a successful unified methodology of classics that will survive for more than about 15 minutes. What will happen is that people will sit in the same room or in front of their own screens and will discuss with one another, and will understand how the other people are doing it differently, and will understand how they themselves are doing it differently. And there may be a certain degree of convergence in some regards, but it'll be immediately balanced by the desire to stay within one's own traditions. You have to remember that these traditions, that these methodologies don't arise in a vacuum. They arise in specific cultural circumstances and are connected with materiality, with religion, with institutions, with languages, with history. And I think that there will be a unified methodology of global philological practice when there is a unified world state in which all differences are abolished. And I don't think I'm going to see that in my lifetime, and I hope that I won't.
Nor do I.
But that's my view. I think that a lot of philology depends on whether you write on palm leaves, which are subject to almost immediate decay in the hot and humid weather temperatures of India, or whether you write upon clay shards that are baked by a fire and last for millennia, whether you write an alphabet, whether you write an ideogram. It's these kinds of differences that I think that people won't want to give up. Does that answer your question, Melina?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Most. We would like to invite you to the University of Crete too. It's a fascinating project that I think our students should definitely learn about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have spent happy visits in Crete and would even go there by internet if it's the only way.
Yes, we will arrange it. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Melina.
If there's no one who wants to jump in, I might just sort of end with soliciting just a final comment. It occurs to me that hopefully there won't be a unified methodology of doing philology, but part of the reasons why there might not be is because philology will always retain its social character. It'll always be about people working together in groups, and that one of the things that's concealed by these older histories of philology, like those of Wilamowitz and Sands, as you pointed out, is that it obscures the conversations, the teams of people, the discussions over a sandwich or a cup of coffee about this problem or that, which is kind of really quite fundamental to what we do.
What everyone can say against COVID-19 and against Zoom, and there's a lot that can be said against COVID-19 and something that can be said against Zoom. COVID-19 makes Zoom indispensable, and Zoom makes such events like this possible. This is, for me, global philology. This is, we are talking out of our different traditions with one another and trying to explain ourselves to one another in such a way that we can go ahead and learn from one another. And I'm very grateful to Ben for having organized this. I'm grateful to all of you who either woke up in the middle of the night or very early, or waited to go to the pub for an hour and 20 minutes. This has been, for me, a wonderful experience. I hope very much to repeat it in Crete and in Sydney, in reality, at some point soon. And please, if you have any other questions that you didn't get a chance to ask, send me an email. I'm easy to find, and I hope to see you in person again someday soon. Thank you, Ben, for organizing this.
Oh no, well, thank you very much, Glenn, for a very stimulating, wonderful discussion, and it's a great way to end the week, and it's a wonderful way to conclude our Critical Antiquities Workshop. So thanks from all of us, from Tristan and I in particular.
Okay, see you soon, I hope. And
Take
care and stay well.
Have a lovely weekend.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.